Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome once again to Tala Historical Society. Tá fáilte of Galir, Irish Gudi or Licht Starul, the Kursi Starula. I'm just introducing you briefly. The sound is not working here at the moment, but we have somebody on the job, I believe. So, here's the expert now. Yeah. Now a few housekeeping things first. First of all, please put your phones on silent. Please put your phones on silent, or indeed off, better again, but at least put them on silent. Thank you. The escapes, if anything goes wrong here, so just follow me, okay? And what else did she tell me to do? Let me see now. Anne gave me a list of instructions here. Yeah. Now tonight's lecture, as you can see there, is on Joe Poole, the sixth Invincible. And our speaker here on my left, Micheál Ó Dublin, a noted historian, in fact a distant relative, I believe, of Anne Devlin. And he has written a book about Anne Devlin, and he has written another book about the restoration of Kilmainham Jail. He did work for 10 years. He's formerly a tour guide in Kilmainham Jail. He also co-organised, along with the other historian Liz Gillis, you might recall her, she was here once or twice. They co-organised the annual conference on the burning of the Custom House. So, without further ado, Adwinia Wishle, Shahe, Micheál Ó Dublin. Thank you.
Okay, so Gurney Margaret, Anhauser and Bad Show, Irish, Shukyan and the Hodgson is Sheridan with that, Gatlin. Thanks a million for the introduction, delighted to be here. This for me is one of the highlights of the year. I love coming to this society and speaking here. Just right now we're waiting for sound, but if everybody can hear me, yeah. Okay, well then sure we can continue without it.
That's better. Yeah. If you're talking to the mic,
it doesn't work.
Is it not?
It's off at the moment. That's what he's trying to do.
Be better when you walk past.
Okay, I'm going to talk about Joe Poole, the so-called sixth Invincible. I first came across Joe when I saw this particular article in the Evening Herald. This was about a lady, Carmel Poole. She just died, and it was about her and her connections to the Easter Rising, and going back as far as Joe. Now, there's no mention of Kilmainham Jail in this particular article, but for some reason I just wondered if there might possibly be a connection. So I wrote to the reporter in the Evening Herald and asked to be put in touch with the Poole family. And fair play to him, he did. He put me in touch with Michael Poole. And Michael had much information on the historic Pooles. And my interest was piqued. So intrigued I become that in fact I eventually ended up writing a book on Joe. Now, in the 1880s and 90s, Joe Poole himself had become a cause célèbre around the world. He was mentioned in newspapers everywhere: Australia, United States, New Zealand, England, Ireland, Europe, everywhere. There were questions even asked about him in the British Parliament after his execution. Today, for some strange reason, he's like the fifth Beatle, or the fourth Musketeer. He's just simply invisible. He was a Dubliner, born in Dublin, to his father Fred and his mother Sophia, and he was the fifth in a family of 9. The Pooles themselves lived in Phibsborough near Blackfriars Bridge at first, but they eventually moved closer to Dublin City. And they moved in fact to Little Britain Street, which is just off what is now Parnell Street. Now his mother died in 1865, and his father remarried in 1873 to a Mary Jane Madden, about a year after Joe's brother Fred had been killed in a tragic accident involving a runaway horse and a carriage in Capel Street, 1872. A further 7 children were born to this marriage. 4 of whom were to actually take part in the Easter Rising. Now, Joe's grandfather and his uncle were all house painters, but Joe followed his father's trade and became a tailor instead. Now, life for Joe was looking good when he married Elizabeth Hanley in July 1880, but unfortunately she died just 6 months later. So, when we look at Joe, we see an ordinary person. Maybe you could argue touched a bit by too much death, but otherwise nothing out of the ordinary. Understandably, after his death of his wife, he may have let himself go a little and turned, it would appear, to drink. Certainly, reporting on one of his trials, a newspaper describes his clothing as greasy and Joe himself as nervous and excitable. Now, physically, he was nothing to look at. He was prematurely balding. He was actually only 28 years of age. Looking a little sad, a little puzzled. And yet, look at his mouth. Maybe a little touch of humour there. So, yes, an ordinary man with strong connections to his own family. For instance, in 1871, he was godfather of his sister Sophia's baby, Mary Jane. Now, what's interesting about this is that child's father was a William Laney, a name we shall unfortunately come up against later. Laney was a Huguenot, non-Catholic, and Joe's father Frederick did not approve of this marriage. In fact, he refused to let it happen, and a fight ensued between Laney and Frederick. But the marriage went ahead in 1869. It was still frowned upon by the Poole family because Sophia was only 17 at this time, 7 years younger than her husband. But she was pregnant, and the wedding was allowed to go ahead under duress. Now, it's possible that that baby died. I'm not quite sure of dates around this, or she may have miscarried. So, why then was Joe Poole to finish his short life by being murdered on the gallows, where he was supposed to be executed for escaping an assassination attempt on himself? Why was this inconsequential tailor stitched up by the police for a crime he did not commit? Now, for that answer, we need in part to look at policing methods in Dublin in the 1880s. A detailed examination is obviously beyond the scope of this talk, but suffice it to say that great reliance was placed by the police on informers and a corrupt jury system, which frequently delivered the desired rather than the just verdict. And we also, in Joe Poole's case, need to go back to Abbey Street in Dublin in late 1882. Now, the news media at the time were full of violent events occurring throughout the country, as landlords and their agents came under attack seemingly everywhere. In County Galway, Walter Burke, a notorious Galway landlord, and Trooper Wallace's escorts, for example, were shot and killed by up to 6 persons on June the 9th, 1882. Subsequently, it was discovered that the rifles used by the assassins, they may have been from the same batch as those seized in June of that year at Clerkenwell in London. So Thomas Walsh had been arrested in connection with the Clerkenwell seizure. He was later accused of having been sending arms to Ireland for many years and to have been involved in conspiracy with others to supply arms to Ireland. He was sentenced to 7 years penal servitude, but later, to ease his time, he later became an informer. By this stage, the Dublin authorities were claiming that there existed in Dublin a secret society working in connection with directions from New York and London. And that those involved in the recent spate of attacks were part of the same conspiracy as those who assassinated Cavendish and Burke on the previous May the 6th, the so-called Invincibles. The Dublin Castle, of course, was worried the police were now keeping a continuous watch on anyone considered disaffected in Dublin, day and night. Much money, castle money, was used to bribe informers, and arrests and false convictions were common. Now, Joe Poole joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood when he was 18 years old. His object, he was later to say in court, was simply to wait until such time as my countrymen would be prepared to strike a blow for independence when I intended to take part with them. He wanted to be prepared, he wanted to be trained, he wanted to be a soldier in the service of his country. But no matter how innocent his reasons, Joe Poole immediately was a marked man because he was a member of a secret society. Now, he gave himself wholeheartedly to that organisation. On the night of July the 3rd, 1882, he went with his friend John Kenny, who was a dock worker, to the Widow Moran's public house in Cork Hill, just beside Dublin Castle. That was a well-known Fenian haunt, and his friends were attending a Fenian raffle there, a fundraiser. Of course, some drink was taken, and afterwards the pair repaired to Kenny's home, where a bottle of whiskey was produced and consumed. And this was a typical night out for two friends, but one that was to see both of them murdered. But you really wonder if Joe Poole actually knew who he was drinking with that night. 2 years earlier, John Kenny had been shot at on the Dublin docks where he worked. It was assumed at the time that this may have been because of his involvement in secret societies. Either a feud within the societies, perhaps. But another suggestion, which was later to surface at Joe's trial, was that this may have been personal. It appears that 33-year-old John Kenny, although married, had an affair with the daughter, one of the daughters of James Byrne, the then Fenian centre. He'd even spent a night, indeed, in Byrne's house. Byrne was rumoured to have instigated, if not actually carried out, the murderous attack, which may have not been intended to kill, but only to warn him off. Now, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, founded in 1858, it had split, as we know, into two factions. The Stephenites, loyal to founder James Stephens, and the Council Party, which elected a Supreme Council to lead it. Towards the end of the 1870s, Joe Poole switched his allegiance from the Stephenites to the Council Party. And this was supported financially from the USA. And he brought with him his brother-in-law, William Laney. Now, at this time, Dan Curley of Invincible's fame was the centre here. In July 1880, Joe married Elizabeth Handley and moved to Exchange Street. Shortly afterwards, he fell out with Curley and left the Council Party, returning to the Stephenites, once again bringing Laney with him. And by mid-1882, he was centre there. However, it appears that he may have actually kept some weapons or documentation belonging to the Council Party, because Curley raided his house looking for these. A fight broke out between Joe and Dan, and they were both arrested, but quickly released. It's believed that this had such an effect on Joe's young bride that her health failed her, and she died later in January 1881. It would appear by this time was definitely on the police radar, and his activities were being directly monitored. John Kenny was now a member of Joe's Stephenite party, and he was keeping Inspector Mallon informed of all the activities of many of the members of the Fenian movement in Dublin, no doubt including Joe in his reports. In fact, it's rumoured that Kenny was the informer that Inspector Mallon was to meet in the Phoenix Park on the day of the Phoenix Park assassinations, a meeting that didn't happen as Mallon was warned off by a police officer. And this was the man that Joe Poole was drinking with on the night of July the 3rd, 1882. Now, after some time in Kenny's house, basically when the whiskey was gone, Joe got up to go. Kenny stood up too, saying he would leave him out the lane. And Kenny's wife actually confirmed this later. Together, the two of them walked down the road and turned the corner into Seville Place. Now, a passer-by later described how early on the morning of July the 4th, 1882, he saw three men apparently involved in an altercation. He heard pistol shots before one man fell. This was afterwards, of course, identified as John Kenny. He fell to the ground, the others running away. The next day, Joe and his brother-in-law, Lamey, were arrested with another man on suspicion of the murder. The police said the arrest of Poole was significant, apart from the Kenny murder, because in reality, they said they suspected him of also being involved in the Phoenix Park assassinations 2 months earlier. The other two men were released. Later, a man named Grundy was arrested, and he, like Poole, was held in custody under the Coercion Act until they both had to be released when that act expired in September 1882. Now, with Poole's arrest, Lamey now became centre, and while Joe was released, he discovered that Lamey had returned to the council party under Curley, bringing indeed most of his men with him. Now, Poole wasn't impressed. He demanded the return of Stephenite's weapons, claiming that those who had defected from his circle were deserters. The council party decided to deal with Joe in its own way, and it is said to have sentenced him to death, and the squad was assembled to carry out this sentence. And what happened next is shrouded in the mist of time and confusion. On the bright moonlit night of Saturday, 25th of November 1882, detectives were keeping an eye on a group of about 40 men who regularly met at the upper end of Abbey Street near a post office that was there. At about 10:30 p.m, as 30 of the group moved off, 10 remained behind, and the detectives who'd been on duty all evening decided to approach them. Crossing the street, 30-year-old Detective Cox, claimed later to be nervous and inexperienced, moved towards Christopher Dowling, one of the men, as he suspected him of carrying weapons. Now, as Cox approached, a whistle was blown, a shout of "Now, fire!" rang out. 3 times, the police later claimed, and Dowling quickly pulled out a revolver, shooting the detective, who slumped to the ground dead. Dowling was later to be sentenced to penal servitude for life for this. Detective Eastwood, drawing his own revolver, ran towards Dowling and shot and wounded him before wrenching the gun from his grasp, despite being fired on twice himself, with one bullet actually going through his hat. Now, another detective fired 2 shots at Dowling and 3 at the other members of the group before Eastwood was set upon by a man called Devine, who knocked him to the ground and was reaching for his own gun to shoot the detective when he was seized by a policeman and a passing soldier. Now, this passing soldier was a man called Danvers. He drew his sword, bayonet, held it to Devine's neck and threatened to kill him if he moved. Crowds milled around the little group and someone shouted, "Kill the soldier!" But before this could be effected, the police trained their weapons on the mob, keeping them at bay until Cox, Devine, Danvers and Dowling could be removed from the scene. Now, much later, Danvers, the soldier, was awarded a medal and a tiny and insulting reward. So one of the newspapers actually got him a subscription to give him some more money in recognition of his bravery. Now, a cab was quickly hailed to take Cox to hospital, but the mob followed it and was so threatening that the accompanying police had to aim their revolvers out of the cab windows to hold their pursuers off until the hospital was reached. But it was too late for the detective. He was already dead. Now, just a few minutes after all of this happened, several judges who'd been dining in Mountjoy Square passed near where the group of men had been gathered, apparently a regular occurrence for them, and the police later surmised that the crowd may have been laying in wait for them. However, another version suggests that the group of men was actually searching for Joe Poole and came upon him in Abbey Street. When one of them drew a gun, the police intervened and the above scene ensued. Joe Poole's own version, in fact, supports this. He claimed to have been drinking in a pub across Abbey Street and had left to walk home when he was attacked. He ran away and was passed by a cab taking the injured policeman to hospital. The police, however, were later to claim that Joe had run after the cab with a gun to try to finish off Detective Cox. So a couple of days after the killing of the detective, Poole was arrested. He was charged with that crime, and he ended up spending Christmas in hospital. On January the 4th, 1883, the Crown prosecutor applied to have the trial of Devine, Dowling and Poole postponed to the next Commission Court term. This was agreed to, and the men were further remanded in custody. Poole was to be mentioned again in court 16 days later, when 21 men arrested in connection with the Phoenix Park assassinations were arraigned in the police court on a charge of conspiracy to murder government officials. Now here, an informer named Farrell gave evidence of the Fenian organisation in Dublin. Apart from him, it was hinted that at least 6 of those in the dock had offered to become informers, but that the authorities had only accepted one of them. In addition, it was believed that 3 other informers already existed: Delaney, Devine and Poole. This was a story that Inspector Mallon did nothing to put down. Now, Poole's brother-in-law, William Laney, he now gave evidence of being a member of the IRB and implicated Joe as well. He had married Joe's sister Sophia in 1869, and remember, as we said earlier, there had been a fight between him and Joe's father, but the wedding did go ahead. He was now in what appears to have been a very loving relationship with his wife. How he got on with the rest of the family is another matter. And you wonder if he was now settling old scores with the Poole family, or if he had been turned when he was arrested for this assault. Either way, to cut a long story, the case against Joe for the Invincible assassinations was dropped, and he was released, despite Laney's attempts to connect him to the affray. With the suspicion that he was an informer, had he made it onto the streets of Dublin, his life would have been forfeit. However, on the steps of the courthouse, he was rearrested and charged now with the murder of John Kenny. Back in Kilmainham jail, he could only wait until his trial. There was a defence fund, the Poole Committee, was formed in the USA to raise much needed money to pay his legal costs. And by 18th of October, Dr. Thomas E. Webb and the QC and Mr. McInerney were engaged to defend him. Reporting this, the New York Times referred to Poole the informer, a comment which drew a sharp, if civil, rebuke in writing from the committee's Honourable Secretary, P.T. Whelan, the very next day. Now, meanwhile, of course, back in Ireland, the session of the commission which was to try Poole opened 23rd of October. 200 special jurors from whom the jury would be selected were summoned for the trial. Poole's brother-in-law, Laney, who had directly implicated Joe in the murder of Kenny, now had an apparent change of heart, and he tried to flee the country. He was arrested before he could leave, however, and was now in custody, believed to be a crucial prosecution witness. Now, outlining the prosecution case, the Attorney General, Mr. Porter, said it would not be proved that Poole had inflicted the fatal wounds on Kenny, but that he had lured him to the place where he was to be killed, and that he was named by the Fenians as one of those delegated to commit the murder. After medical evidence of cause of death, etc. was given, Lamy appeared for the prosecution. He was noticeably nervous, but still claimed that Joe had told him the night of the killing that Kenny was dead and had given him details of the assassination. Sarah, Kenny's wife, deposed that Joe was with Kenny when he left her house. Now, Dr. Webb, counsel for Poole, contended that the charges against his client were founded upon the merest suspicion, and that suspicious acts only had been proved. He maintained that the government had wholly failed to prove its case against Poole, and that Kenny had been shot in mistake for him. Following the judge's summing up, the jury retired, and after an hour's consultation, returned and announced that they were divided and could not and would not reach a decision. Justice Murphy then discharged them, remanding Poole in custody in Kilmainham jail until the next Monday, November the 19th, when he would be retried. Now, the second trial was before the same judge and with the same legal teams on both sides. An inordinate amount of jurors this time was objected to by the Crown, and they stood down, leaving, it is alleged, a predominantly loyalist group of men to decide Poole's fate. Now, once this new jury was impanelled, the Attorney General reprised the evidence given at the first trial, claiming that it proved Poole knew of the Fenian plan to get rid of Kenny, and that even if he didn't strike the fatal blow or fire the fatal shot, he'd lured Kenny to his doom and was present at and part of the murder. Kenny's widow repeated her evidence before William Lamy took to the witness stand. He said that at the time Kenny was murdered, he believed it was for being an informer, but he had reason to change that opinion and now believed Kenny had been killed in revenge for the seduction of a girl, but offered no supporting evidence for this. Now, next, Francis Gagan, who lived in the same room as Poole, testified that on the night of the murder, Poole had entered the room and said to another occupant, "Kenny will tell no more." Dr. Webb QC then addressed the jury, pointing out again that no evidence had been produced to prove his client guilty. Again, no defence witnesses were called. Justice Murphy instructed the members of the jury on their duties in a speech later described as a biased legal harangue against Joe, rather than the neutral recap of the law and legal matters that the jury had to consider. So this time the members of the jury retired, and within 40 minutes they were back. They delivered a verdict of guilty, as instructed. The clerk of the court now asked Joe Poole if he had anything to say as to why sentence of death should not be passed on him. And he, standing erect with one hand on the dock, replied in what the papers refer to as earnest and excited tones. He gave a reasonably long speech, and this is just a piece of it. He said, "Welcome, gentlemen. You have found me guilty of the murder of John Kenny. I wish to say in the presence of this court, in the presence of my fellow countrymen that I love, that it is false. I believe it is on account of being an enemy, humble as I am, of the government under which I have the misfortune to live, that I have been persecuted in the manner I have been. Still, I am not afraid to die or ashamed of what has brought me to the scaffold. It is not for murder. It is for being a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood that has brought me to the scaffold, and I am prepared to die for it." Now he was brought back to Kilmainham jail to await his fate, but as the murder was taking place in Dublin City, he was soon after moved to City Jail, the City Bridewell, Richmond jail. There was now an appeal for clemency, this was got up by the public, and it was fairly common practice indeed to do this. And it was signed by over 300 prominent names, including most of the members of the jury which had just convicted him, but significantly the Archbishop of Dublin refused to sign it. But Earl Spencer, the Lord Lieutenant, rejected it on advice from Detective Mallon, among others. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Spencer may have had another reason to refuse, however. Following Forster's resignation as Chief Secretary of Ireland in 1882 after the Communion Treaty with Parnell and the release of Parnell, Spencer was appointed Lord Lieutenant in his place to take charge of the British government's Irish policy. He had travelled to Ireland with his new First Secretary, Lord Frederick Cavendish, who was assassinated with the permanent Under-Secretary, Thomas Henry Burke, in the Phoenix Park by the Invincibles on May the 6th, 1882. Poole, of course, had earlier been arrested as a member of the Invincibles. Now, Joe Poole went bravely to his death on December the 18th, 1883 at 8:05 a.m. It had been assumed that Binns, the British hangman, would carry out the execution, but as he was the day before in London to execute O'Donnell for the killing of the Invincible informer Carey, an alternative volunteer executioner was drafted in to do the job. This man, using the alias of Jones, was allegedly from Belfast. As Jones was putting the white hood over Poole's head, someone pointed out to him that he had forgotten to tie the prisoner's feet. He had to quickly do this before pulling the lever that sent Joe 9 feet, it's about 2.75 metres, to his death. The black flag was run up the prison flagpole, and the crowd outside, mostly women, cried out when they saw it, people crossing themselves and praying for his soul. Now, the usual inquest was held within the jail at 10 a.m, following which Joe Poole was buried in quicklime in an unmarked grave within the grounds of the prison, as per the sentence. Later, however, reports came out about the execution. It had been botched. The rope used was too long, and Joe's feet ended up touching the ground when he was dropped. Frantically, the rope had been pulled up again by the hangman, the horrified onlookers watching as the doctor ran down into the chamber beneath the platform, where the prisoner was standing on his toes and presumably putting his arms around him, clung to him, dragging him down until he finally died by strangulation rather than a broken neck. And that should really be the end of the story, but of course it's not. 15 years later, 13th September 1898, a group of 6 workmen for the Office of Public Works, they were carrying out alterations to the former prison that had closed. It was now Wellington Barracks. And they stumbled across Joe Poole's unmarked grave. The police were quickly called and they took control of the scene. Now, Joe's stepmother applied for the return of his body to his family so that he could be reburied with his father, who died allegedly of a broken heart 3 years before in 1895. The story was well covered in the papers of the day, and it was widely believed that the family's request would be granted. This was common practice in such situations, but it wasn't. No reason for a refusal was given, and Joe's body was reinterred in the grounds of Wellington Barracks, where it remains to this day. So, you might ask, why was the family's request not granted, even on humanitarian grounds? Now, the argument that Joe's sentence was to be hanged by the neck until dead and then buried in the grounds of that prison doesn't stand up to examination. For Joe was executed in Richmond prison in accordance with the sentence and then buried there, so that's what the sentence was. But the prison had closed in 1887 and become a military barracks. Therefore, the part of his sentence which stipulated that he be buried in the grounds of the prison where he was executed could no longer be carried out. He was not supposed to be buried in a barracks. The judge did not say that. Joe's sentence, I argued, was completed the day the prison ceased to be a jail. So there was no valid reason for refusing his family's request for the return of his body. But there is a theory as to why it was refused in relation to his execution. If you go back to the post-mortem, the doctor who attended certified that death occurred within 3.5 seconds. Despite the evidence of the attending media, who claimed that Joe had ended up touching the ground under the gallows with his feet, it suggested the rope was pulled up until Joe strangled to death. Some say the doctor did this, the hangman being apparently petrified, as his so-called perfect execution went horribly wrong. Others suggest the doctors went, as I said earlier, beneath the gallows and added his own weight to Joe's to strangle him. Now, but if either of these scenarios are correct, and the family got Joe's body back, it should have been easy enough to verify whether he died of a broken neck, i.e. a successful execution, or by strangulation, possibly at the hands of the doctor who certified otherwise. Now, if Joe's neck wasn't broken, then he was murdered. For it was the doctor who either pulled up the rope or pulled Joe down. This would be murder. The only person entitled to take Joe's life that day was the appointed executioner, the hangman. If Dr. Byrne, the doctor, was still alive in 1898, then there may have been a deliberate wish by the authorities to cover up for him, or even to protect him from the charge of murder, with the others present at Joe's execution charged as accomplices. Now, most people in Ireland believe Joe Poole was innocent of the crime for which he was executed. And Chief Superintendent Mallon, who, when still a detective, had been sent to arrest Parnell in 1881, escorting to Kilmainham jail, said to be one of those Poole had been ordered to kill by the Fenians. He later admitted that Joe was innocent in private. According to Mallon, the police had insisted on Poole's conviction, not because he had assassinated Kenny, but because he was allegedly in charge of the group of men in Middle Abbey Street, November 1882, when Dowling had killed Detective Cox. But Mallon changed this story later, and the following appeared in a tribute to him on his retirement in the Australian newspaper, the Kalgoorlie Western Argus, Tuesday, the 4th of February, 1902. It says in part, Joe Poole, the Fenian centre, was executed for a murder he never committed, and which in fact he tried to prevent. A high official whose duty it was to recommend or withhold a reprieve saw John Mallon on the matter. Mallon told him plump and plain the man was innocent. The high official asked, "Is Poole a bad man?" The reply was, "Yes, a very bad man. Although he's not been guilty of this murder, practically certain that he was an accessory before the fact to an assassination in Manchester." Upon this, the reprieve was withheld. Let's go back a little bit. This is the recommendation for arrest sheet for Joe, which Inspector Mallon filled in. It contains a section titled Grounds of Suspicion, and in part that says, Poole is very seldom in employment and is evidently living by some secret organisation. Mrs. Tinsler, whose husband was sentenced to 20 years penal servitude for the murder of Peter Andrews, is receiving money, and Poole is supposed to be the bearer of, and the frequency of his visits to Liverpool support the theory that he is a messenger. So from this, one could deduce that despite unsupported claims of being involved in murders in Dublin and Liverpool, etc., etc., the real reason Joe was murdered on the gallows was because he was suspected of being the bagman for the Fenian organisation in Dublin, bringing American money on its last leg from Liverpool to Dublin to finance the activities of, among others, the Invincibles in Dublin. He was paying or carrying the money to pay for the unrest in Dublin. And this is something that worried the castle, and Mallon in particular, as can be seen from this news item in also from Australia in the Argus Melbourne about a report on Cox's funeral. And if you read the bit above, and secure funds, etc. This is the Fenians were looking to secure funds. They needed them. Without funds, they couldn't do anything. People had to work. You can't be rebellious if you're working. Joe was bringing in the money. These people could afford it. Now, not illegal to carry money, or at least it wasn't then. So Joe couldn't be got for that. So trumped up charges were laid against him. But the final word on Joe Poole must surely come from the parliamentary debate in the House of Commons after his execution, when Charles Stuart Parnell raised his case as a miscarriage of justice and said, after sentence was pronounced, Poole might have purchased safety by accepting the suggestions and offers of the Crown officials to bear testimony against persons who were as innocent as he was. Poole refused these offers and went to his death. No higher heroism has ever been shown, either in the history of Ireland or in the history of any other country, than has been exhibited by Poole. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was certainly a gripping story. As gripping a story as I've heard of these lectures for some time. Now, there's if any of you want to ask a few questions, shoot. Easy ones now.
Please.
Any relation to Joe Poole here?
I don't see any of them here, but it's a huge family. I mean, in Joe's case alone, there was 15, 16 of the family surviving. Not, they may have been more born, but they all survived. A lot of them have descendants, and they have met or corresponded with many. I'm in touch with relatives in the States, in Australia, in Holland, as well as here. They're all over the place. They all have different takes on this story, they all have angles, and they all have little bits of information, which when you put it all together, gets you this story out of it.
Any relation to Joe Brady and the Invincible, the rest of them?
Any relation to Joe?
Of Joe Brady, he was one of the...
Yeah, I know relation to Joe Brady, all right.
Are there any here tonight?
None that I can see, not that I've seen. I actually unveiled a plaque to Joe a couple of months ago.
Oh, yeah.
And where he lived, the house where he lived.
When you say he was carrying back money from Liverpool, the last leg of the journey, was he on his own, and what sort of monies did he carry with him?
Oh, well...
In relation to, say, today's...
Yeah. I don't know, is a simple answer to this. It would appear that he was on his own. I mean, there's no suggestion anybody was with him in Mallon's claims about him going to Liverpool. But certainly, I mean, there was an organisation over there, and he was in contact with that. The money would have been hundreds of pounds that he'd be bringing back, which in today's money is tens of thousands. The reward money for after the Invincibles was huge. Government offered in one case £10,000. I mean, that would be millions today. I suppose if you were earning £5 a week at the time, you'd be doing well. But obviously, if you're not working, funnily enough, you actually spend more money. Drink costs a lot. And he was basically bringing back the money to pay for all of them in Dublin. So it had to be huge amounts of money.
And when you say that, was that money coming from New York? The fact that there was a shipping line from New York to Liverpool at the time, it would have been the same one that had operated during the famine, who brought people out from the famine.
Yeah, there was always money coming from the States to Ireland. Originally, it came directly. It would come as famine relief, that sort of thing. But this clandestine money to foment rebellion had to come other ways. Ports would be watched here and money would be stopped. So bringing it in from England was obviously a safer way of doing so. You could bring in smaller amounts because you could do it more frequently once you got it somewhere in England. So yes, the shipping lines would ship it to various places in England.
I can't see him travelling on his own for security reasons, because from The little bit of reading that I have done about these people.
There may have been others, but he wouldn't necessarily know that.
Yeah.
There may be others watching him, travelling with him to make sure everything was all right. Because if he turned up in Dublin and said, "I've been robbed," oh, the police took it, where's the evidence? So you need someone to be able to say that. So he was probably being watched. But travelling on his own, he would be less suspicious travelling on his own. Crowded people, especially if they're known, wouldn't go down well. They could be stopped and searched.
Would the organisation that he was travelling through would have been reputable to Irish sources that was coming from Liverpool?
Well, they would have known him.
Yeah.
They would have known him. I mean, Liverpool was Ireland.
Yeah.
So many Irish people there.
There's questions over here. Yourself?
Yeah, sorry.
What was the Archbishop signing? I just couldn't get that bit.
He didn't sign it.
What was he to sign?
And that really put the kibosh on it. If he'd signed it, they would have had to rescind the death sentence. At least.
Yeah. Sorry, that's.
That was the point. But he openly didn't sign it. It was notable he didn't sign it, and that was a problem. Now, why didn't he sign it? Well, as often happens, the archbishops, etc., were in cahoots with Dublin Castle. They had to watch what they were doing from their own church's point of view to protect the church, and often did things at that level that they wouldn't be doing further down. And they did things openly to appear to be loyal, but maybe further down the organisation they weren't. But the important thing was that in this instance, the Archbishop had to do something and didn't. I warned you.
Was Richmond Prison part of Richmond Barracks?
No.
Because that clock tower thing in the photographs is very familiar.
Yeah, no.
Wellington Barracks is the one in the Phoenix Park. That's not right.
Griffith College.
My apologies. Sorry, I'm wrong.
So where was Richmond Prison?
Yeah, it's Griffith College now.
Oh. On South.
But South Griffith College. And Joe was in there somewhere.
Oh, it's South Circle Road.
Yeah. And Joe was buried in there somewhere. Nobody knows where.
Is his grave marked? I was going to ask you that, Michal. And is it a solitary grave? Is there other graves around it?
No, it's on his own. There were only 2 people hanged there, ever. Joe, but they were both buried there, but not in a graveyard, because there were so few hangings, they didn't have a formal graveyard. If I recall, the newspaper report of them finding his body said it was 50 paces in from the front gate. I've been told I'm wrong, because others who claim they know where the body is say it's around the back in the playing fields, much nearer to the railway line or the canal, but I don't know. Nobody so far has found it. The family went back, I think, in the 1920s, 1930s to try and find it, and couldn't find it. And the whole place is built. There's temporary buildings all over it now, so God knows where he is.
And
Okay.
they've done what they've done, what the Republicans done in Belfast jail, mark a break in the wall. There are a number of Republicans who are buried in Belfast jail.
That's right.
There is 1 or 2 markers on the
walls.
Yeah.
That was common enough practice to do, but in this instance it appears he's not buried near a wall. It appears to have been buried well out from it in an open area. You see, it just as with the Invincibles in Kilmainham jail, they were buried under the gallows, beneath the gallows, and it may well be that that's what happened to him also. Because the gallows would be quite big, it's a huge box. You're standing up on top of that, and it's got to be deep enough to drop you underneath it without you hitting the ground, just to protect the sensibilities of those watching.
So, in other words, the Republicans would have perfected the way that they had of marking things later as they went along, and that it was sort of a bit ad hoc in Invincible days, and like the Republicans, I think in Belfast jail or in the 30s, they would have had.
Yeah, but a lot of those graves in Belfast were marked by prison wardens as well. The thing is that what Republicans in the prison, it was a prison that was falling out of use. There were very few prisoners there. It's unlikely that anybody would have marked it. They may well have put a stone down or something to mark it, but all that's gone, As I say, there was obviously no marking because these men from the OPW stumbled across it. Nothing to indicate where it was. I'm quite sure that the OPW could tell us where it is. They, the OPW, and I mean nothing bad by this, it's a British institution. It's the oldest British institution in this country. Like all British institutions, is a superb record keeper. It keeps bus tickets, for God's sake. It keeps everything. So it must have a full record from those men of where they were working at the time when that body came up. They haven't released the information. I can understand why. They don't want people going in and taking that body out again. Or they don't want to have to do it. But I'm sure they would have the information.
Anybody else want to say anything? Okay, here.
Sir.
Michal,
yeah.
What evidence is there about his relationship with Kerry, the informer, and the others who were involved in the Phoenix Park?
Well, just he was the centre at one stage. But you see, all of these organisations are knitted together. The old Irish word "fitcha-fudge," it's everything. There's nothing, no clear divisions between them. There were organisations within organisations. The Invincibles have yet to be thoroughly explained. Now, Shane Kenna, thankfully, has written a book on them, which will be published, I believe, later this year. It's going to be the first decent book on them. I know other books have been written, Corf and others have written books, but this, using modern information that's available, hopefully will explain it. And I talked to Shane when he was alive about a lot of this, and he certainly had some good, very clear ideas on where they'd come. There is a suggestion he was at one point a member of the Invincibles. I've seen no evidence of that, but if he was, he pulled out. I don't believe Poole was an active man in the sense of being willing to go out and kill people, or that. Are you quite happy to go and carry money and do all that sort of thing? But I think his idea was, as he said in court, join the organisation, get trained as a soldier, know how to use a gun, know what to do, and when the call came, a national uprising, that he would go out and join that was his intention, to be a soldier ready to fight for his country, rather than an assassin. So if he knew them, and there's no reason why you wouldn't know them. I mean, you're talking about publicans, you're talking about city councillors, etc. You know them anyway. They were all drinking in the same places, Mullet's pubs, for God's sake. They were all in those. So he would certainly know them. But how closely is another matter. They would turn up. I mean, at the raffle that he turned up at, I mean, who knows who else was there. Many others have been at that. So he would have had a drink with them, probably. He would know them. Unlikely because of the organisation that he would see them within the organisation. So, I mean, I'm guessing, to be honest, about it. There's no clear evidence of how closely he was with them.
Yourself?
Michal, could I ask you two questions? Sure. One relates to Joe Poole himself. Did he work from home or did he work for a company?
Joe, he worked for himself. He was a tailor.
At home? Because there's many small factories that...
Well, interestingly, I assumed that by being a tailor, it meant, so many women said they were tailors, for example, and really what it meant was seamstresses. Basically they sewed rather than cutting out and designing, as you would imagine a tailor to do. And I assumed that this is what Joe was, because so many of them were tailors, I assume that's what he was, but at one stage in the arrest document, the one that's setting up to arrest him, Mallon says that he was a tailor and the other was only a labourer, and therefore they shouldn't have been mixing. So he saw a class divide, which to me would suggest that Joe was what I would see a tailor as. Someone who measures you, cuts out the cloth, designs the suit, and puts it together.
Just on that,
which would suggest he worked on his own.
No, that Henry Rhodes, he was a tailor, but he worked in Anglesey Street for a guy called McGregor.
Yeah.
And there was 13 or 14 importmen there.
Yeah.
So that's
Well,
just.
but Joe was often unemployed, as they said.
Yeah, but he's
Yes.
just saying that's where he worked.
Yeah, he was.
But
the man.
he was. I always thought he worked at home. But the second
Yeah.
question I'd like to ask is related to the jury. You said the jury was handpicked.
Second one.
How can you prove that? How did you come to that conclusion? Let's say.
Well, by the fact that everybody says it, basically, the class of person.
Their address.
Yes, their jobs.
Yeah.
Their religion in particular.
Okay.
All of this, and I mean, even if the religion wasn't stated, you'd guess it by the name. You know, I mean, everybody knew at the time who was.
Okay.
Who wasn't. So Catholics were objected to.
Okay, that's fine.
Simple enough, get them out of it. And I mean, it was savage the amount of people who were normally 10, 15 people might be objected to, and you do it as much just for the crack, you know, to show that you're doing your job. But in this case, the Crown objected to everybody who might have given him a chance. I mean, he was walking into a death trap going into court on the Monday.
Right, so would we call a halt there, or does anybody else want to say anything? Okay, Micheál, thank you very much again for a magnificent lecture. Very well done. And finally, there's a box at the back for donations on your way out. It helps to keep the show on the road here. So, Gurmila Mahagav, thank you very, very much.